Thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to talk a little bit about the Ashmolean Museum. Now, normally, when I introduce the Ashmolean Museum, I'm not doing so surrounded by colleagues from other university museums, and I say unabashedly that the Ashmolean is unquestionably the world's greatest university museum. I'm not going to say that today, but although it is unquestionably the world's most visited university museum, with almost, with over 900,000 visitors a year. So as well as being a university museum, it is a great public museum. I will not, however, presume that you have all been there, so I will just give the briefest of introductions about of the museum. At the moment, there is this display on the lower ground floor, which stealing unashamedly from the Louvre Lens, is our mini Galerie du Temps. So you travel through this gallery from a hand axe carved not far from Oxford, in fact, in 30,000 BC, forward through time and across cultures. And this gallery is an attempt to give a sense of the range of the collections at the Ashmolean. We are a museum of art and archaeology. We cover millennia, and we cover much of the world, but not all of the world. It's a museum focused on the art and archaeology of Europe and Asia and North Africa, the Mediterranean world, and rather embarrassingly not various areas of the world that when the collections at Oxford University were divided and split up in the early 20th century were considered not civilization. So we don't have sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and Australasia. But you can take extraordinary journeys through the collections of the Ashmolean. From, for example, this extraordinary skull made in Jericho, perhaps in 6000 BC, through to this wonderful, extraordinary little Lucian Freud naked portrait from the 1970s. And there are similar journeys that you can take within the museum. The museum underwent an extraordinary transformation under my predecessor, Christopher Brown, and reopened in 2009 with a display strategy that sought absolutely to make these connections across culture and across time. I mean, the strategy was described as crossing cultures, crossing time, and rather than placing all Chinese art in one corner and all Indian art in another, it sought to suggest the connections between different cultures as one moves through time, as one moves up through the gallery. And this was a display strategy very firmly directed at a wide public. And as I say, extraordinarily successful in doing so. So visitor numbers following that transformation more than tripled. They've fallen down a bit, but as I say, almost 1 million people come to the museum each year. And then that transformation was followed by a transformation of the Egyptian galleries, which opened in 2011. And I arrived at the museum 2.5 years ago, and to my surprise, from the outside, this hugely successful project, which had transformed the museum and the way in which it engaged with its many, many publics, nonetheless left within the university a slight niggle, or indeed, in some areas, a degree of resentment. And the suggestion that the museum, in catering so successfully for this wide audience that it was addressing through this transformation, the museum was somehow abandoning its true constituency, that is, the university. And university museums are clearly obliged to and expected to benefit the university to which they belong and in which they sit. And of course, university museums therefore have to address the university's core purpose, advancing knowledge through research and through teaching. The shame is, if you like, that this resentment, in a sense, I think the museum was so successful at addressing a public that the university didn't recognize how well it was also addressing its students and indeed its researchers. But I want to step back slightly to consider the founding of the museum. Again, depending on the company to which I'm speaking, I can occasionally suggest that the Ashmolean is unquestionably the world's oldest public museum. You do have to qualify that in various ways in order to make it true. But it is an astonishingly early foundation. A purpose-built museum that opened its doors in 1683 in this building, which is now the home of another of Oxford's museums, the Museum of the History of Science. And its purpose, the purpose of the original Ashmolean, was embodied in this building. It has 3 floors. You can't see the basement, but the collection was on the top floor, the founding collections of the museum, which were extraordinarily various and were a sort of cabinet of curiosities of a 17th century kind, focused on natural sciences. So much of the collection was natural, what we would now call natural history, geology, but also, of course, man-made objects as well. The ground floor was the School of Natural Sciences, containing Elias Ashmole's library, but also a place for teaching. And in the basement, there was a laboratory. Here is Elias Ashmole, our founder, and some of the extraordinary things that were in that founding collection. The simply extraordinary Powhatan's mantle. This is, well, arguably the most significant Native American artifact anywhere. Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas, this a gift from Powhatan to King James of England. And one of the most extraordinary things in the museum, but of course actually now discussed really in the context of the founding of the museum, which is something that is mildly concerning, that it is not discussed in for, if you like, what it is. The dodo was also part of that founding collection, which is now, of course, in the Natural History Museum in the university, and then a carved peach stone. And there were, of course, many objects of that nature as well. But this foundation had a very clear, I think, sense of purpose. So there was a collection on the top floor, a school library on the middle floor, a laboratory in the basement. This is a combination of objects that, and founded on sort of clearly Baconian ideas that the way to advance knowledge was to examine the material world, but also to experiment. And this combination of objects, research, teaching, experiment as a way of understanding the world and our place within it seems to me a fairly persuasive definition of a museum, and in particular perhaps a university museum. But even at its very founding, this idea was the subject of quite a bit of carping within the university. And indeed, as the museum was being founded, it was already being dismissed with the wonderful term of a knick-knackatory, that this was simply a random collection of objects, ill-assembled, with no sort of overarching intellectual my mind's gone. I got up very early this morning. But with no real purpose and with no possibility of it being revealing. And indeed, in a splendidly disobliging account in the early 18th century by a German aristocrat, Conrad von Uffenbach, comes to Oxford, goes to see the famous Ashmolean Museum, and is deeply unimpressed, not only because the collections don't meet the standards that he had come to expect in the German princely collections of Europe, but also because the curator of the museum was drunk in the pub and absent, and that the organization of the museum made no sense, and most shocking of all, that the public were actually allowed up into the museum, even splutters Conrad, the women are allowed to come up to the museum and fondle the objects in what he describes as the usual English manner. And so, from its very beginnings, there was a question as to this foundation's usefulness to the university, whether it actually was a sensible way to advance knowledge. And if one looks at its collections now, and these have obviously developed in many and various ways, and the museum today is a very different thing from that founded in the 17th century. But what remains the case is that the collections that we hold have been assembled for a wide variety of different reasons and purposes, and which create a challenge, I think, for a university museum today, because those purposes may no longer hold. The extraordinary collection of old master drawings at the Ashmolean was built around a gift of drawings by Michelangelo and Raphael that had belonged to the English portrait painter Thomas Lawrence. These were bought by, through subscription for the university and given to the university with the specific purpose of improving the morals of university students. There was this idea that simply by putting a student in close proximity to the great works of the High Renaissance, that somehow, through some mysterious form of osmosis, morals would be improved. Equally, of course, our great archaeological collections were put together essentially because of Oxford University's engagement in various archaeological excavations. The great Arthur Evans, the controversial Arthur Evans, one of my predecessors, who himself actually, those were the days, bought an area of Crete so he could excavate Knossos and then reconstruct it with the marvelous new material of concrete. But the extraordinary collections, or Minoan collections, were held by the museum, were of course a result of those excavations, just as the extraordinary collections of pre-dynastic Egyptian material were the result of Oxford's involvement in the excavations of Hierakonpolis. Equally, collections such as our collections of Greek vases were essentially assembled as study collections, in part by the great scholar of Greek vases, John Beazley, who one of the sort of founding scholars of attribution of Greek vase painting. And so both scholars helping build the collections in order to create study collections, and also collectors. One of the gifts to the museum, this extraordinary and slightly overwhelming collection of first period Worcester porcelain given to the museum by Mr. Marshall, who had collected it and gave it to the museum on the express condition, one under which various directors have attempted to free themselves, but without success, that the entire collection be shown the whole time. And so this is our ceramic gallery. You would not know it, but a very interesting story of the development of European ceramics is told around the outside walls of this gallery, but the whole is swamped by this extraordinary and very comprehensive collection of Worcester porcelain. Invaluable as a study collection for those studying Worcester porcelain, but as you may suggest, or may imagine, there are not that many of those people. The point I make, though, is, of course, most of the collections in the museum were not assembled for teaching. They were not assembled with any view to them being useful to the university beyond, in some areas, as research collections, which they remain. There are some exceptions to that rule. A very interesting one, and sorry, this is a rather feeble image to reflect this very extraordinary collection that Ruskin gave to the museum in the mid-19th century, which was his teaching collection. The collection of drawings, of photographs, of prints from which he taught drawing. And equally, the cast collection was one that was assembled in order to teach the development of classical art, and is indeed still used in that way. But for the most part, the collections were not and have not historically been used as to teach from. There are, of course, some exceptions, and perhaps the most important one in some respects is the coin collection. The Ashmolean has one of the great collections of coins, over 300,000 coins, which have always been used in teaching. The curators of the coin collection have always taught into classical archaeology and integrates the Greek and Latin courses, teaching the history of the classical world through the coins. But if one looks across the museum, the extent to which there are about 30 curators looking after the different areas of the collection within the museum, and the extent to which they teach is entirely, in some senses accidental, entirely dependent on each of them. If you burrow down and look at their contracts, which I have done, you will discover that they all their contracts express the obligation or expectation, or in some cases the right to teach, in entirely different ways. There is no clear, as it were, expectation on, from the museum as within the contracts as to how much teaching might be expected of the curators. If one then looks to what they're doing, you find that some are teaching an enormous amount, teaching as much as a lecturer. Our curator of our Egyptian curator, essentially teaches a course in Egyptology, essentially because he volunteered to do so. And others, one finds, perhaps give one lecture in a sort of half-empty room once a year, and perhaps don't. And that is something that we have been looking at. But what has happened in the wake of the redevelopment of the museum is a complete transformation and a strategically directed transformation of the way in which the museum and its collections are used within the teaching of the wider university. As part of the redevelopment of the museum, new study rooms were created specifically for teaching from the collection. They were not created with quite the degree of forethought and attention to the practicalities of teaching from collections as those at the FOG in Harvard were, which we might hear about in a moment. But nonetheless, they are there, and they provide a place and spaces in which teaching from the collection can take place. But the real transforming moment came with the winning of a grant by the Ashmolean from the Andrew Mellon Foundation in the States for something that was described as the University Engagement Program. And this was we've now had 2 grants from the Mellon Foundation, one lasting for 3 years and one in which we are 2 years into a further 5 years. And in the first 3 years, the extraordinarily generous grant allowed us to appoint 5 people to help engage the university with our collections through teaching. And these 5 people were a director of this program, and then 3 teaching curators, as they were described, and then actually not an entire person, 0.6 of a museum assistant who was going to, the idea was, run around and collect objects and take them to the teaching rooms as they were required. The fact that this is how this was, and this obviously happened under my predecessor, that it was decided that the way to advance the teaching of teaching with the collection in the university was through a project of this kind, almost separate from the curatorial body of the existing curatorial body, has had both its advantages and disadvantages. And it was, I think, very challenging for those who arrived as these teaching curators, because they had two worlds to negotiate with. One was the curatorial departments as they already existed in the museum, and they were more or less welcoming and helpful, depending on various things. But then they also had to negotiate the university and had to essentially advertise themselves individually, go out there into the university, make connections, and develop ways of teaching from the collection. And the fact is that I don't think, even now in retrospect, there was any shortcut to that process. Certainly within Oxford, the way it works, Oxford prides itself on its decentralisation. That everyone is an autonomous individual working within their departments and faculties. And really what those teaching curators did, and they arrived with huge energy and enthusiasm, was go out and sit down and talk to people and make connections and develop ideas. And of course, some of those ideas fell on rocky soil, but many fell on very fertile soil indeed. And in retrospect, and again, I think from talking to those involved, this was to some extent an accident, but was a result simply of the quality of applicants for these roles. But in retrospect, a really important fact was that those teaching curators appointed were mid-career academics, that they carried with them enough authority to command the respect both within the museum and within the university. They were not, and these kind of projects have been funded by the Mellon Foundation in the States very widely, and very frequently those teaching posts are postdocs, and I think the fact that in Oxford or at the Ashmolean that was not the case has been hugely beneficial to the development of the programme. Also, and again, I think reasonably by accident, but the three teaching curators' areas of expertise mapped onto the existing curatorial departments within the university, within the museum. So one was a Western art specialist, one an ancient world specialist, and one a Asian art specialist. But having said that, they were not expected to, indeed they were charged to make connections with departments and faculties that were not previously using the collections. And so they were essentially encouraged away from archaeology and history of art, the two faculties who already used the collections, to other places. And the results were, and have been, extraordinarily impressive. And so at the end of that first three-year phase, essentially within that project, so the director and the three teaching curators were teaching over almost 4,000 university students across 25 departments, all the divisions, so sciences, medics, as well as English and the humanities and the social sciences, into 25 different departments in all kinds of different ways. And again, the ways in which the teaching was developed was down to individual conversations within separate faculties. But they were teaching, yes, into traditional departments such as anthropology and prehistory, Egyptology, classics, history of art, but also into modern languages, into clinical medicine, into psychology, into theology, into geography, and into the Said Business School as well. As two examples, taught in rather different ways, and I hope it's useful to talk practicalities to a degree. A course in English was developed by one of the, in the English faculty for undergraduates, third year option, which was looking at pilgrimage and religious texts, was developed side by side with the English tutor, so that the expertise that the teaching curator had could live alongside the discussions being carried out by the English tutor, looking at pilgrimage and objects associated with it. Another of the teaching curators has developed an entire course within the School of Geography and the Environment, and care an object, an ivory box, 17th century, created in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and showing members of the Dutch East India Company being welcomed into a port as their ships sit outside. But this curator teaching both in the School of Geography but also the Department of International Development. In the case, again, to talk practicalities of the School of Geography and the Environment, this it's incredibly intensive work. So there is a lecture that the teaching curator gives to 70 students, and then that is followed by an entire day of handling sessions in which I think 12 students at a time come in for over an hour, sit in the study rooms, look at particular objects from the collection, they leave, and another of the group come in, so that she is dealing with the entire cohort during the session and during the course. I thought it might be helpful just to read a couple of quotes from both tutors within who have worked with the University Engagement Programme and students. So the first from the Professor of Biogeomorphology and Heritage Conservation and the head of the School of Geography and the Environment, who says, simply put, this teaching has had a transformative impact on both teaching and networking within the area of heritage conservation in Oxford. Not only did the teaching curator contribute extremely well to this joint teaching programme, but she also made connections between my research and teaching interests and those of others, which I had failed to make in over 25 years in Oxford. She has ensured that the Ashmolean have made very effective and creative contributions to our teaching. The students consistently give very good feedback about the practical and academic sessions, and this is a dynamic and important contribution to my teaching. And again, Abigail Williams, a professor of English literature, and I think this is important because it suggests what teaching from objects can provide, which other kinds of teaching cannot and do not. My own close experience of object teaching has been as a co-teacher on several papers over the past 2 years, having invited a member of the Ashmolean University Engagement Programme to co-design both undergraduate and MST options in English. Looking at important conceptual developments through objects enabled the students to ask questions they would not otherwise have asked, and to draw together literary and cultural history in unexpected ways. Enabling students to think through objects can help them to literalize quite abstract ideas and about culture and social practices, and to see in a material way the way gender, class, and religion shape culture. It also enables them to take their new experience of unfamiliar fields to problematize their own. It is certainly the case that the students on these courses produced very high quality work. And although I think one needs to be careful about such metrics, and the data sets, for want of a better word, are very small. In that particular English course, those students who chose that option, exploring the collections in the Ashmolean, in their results did much better statistically than the students who did not take that particular option. As I say, these are early days, but it is nonetheless suggestive. I I think there have been a number of lessons from the University Engagement Programme that we have tried to address and respond to in the second phase of this programme. One is that there is a potentially insatiable and indeed unserviceable demand for this kind of teaching. And that if one has energetic and brilliant teachers going out into the wider university and essentially offering their services, offering to provide teaching or to share teaching, it is not entirely unsurprising that demand swiftly outstrips supply. And so there is a risk there to the museum. Another lesson learned is that some teaching is considerably more valued by the university than other teaching. And that what is clearly important, and if the museum is to prove its value to the university as being able to provide resources and indeed expertise towards teaching, is that we need to establish courses and papers within the curriculum that depend upon object-based learning, and that we need to participate in the examining of those courses as well and the setting of questions for them. And we have had considerable success in doing that. Another lesson is that the demands of teaching from collections are much greater than we anticipated. That 0.6 of a museum assistant is not enough. That as demand gets greater, the requirement to collect objects, to prepare objects, to research objects, to find objects, to bring them to the right place, to take them back again, is very labor-intensive work, and one that is almost always underestimated when members of faculty are considering object-based courses, and indeed when curators are as well. And so that is something that we have also addressed. But most importantly, I think, is that object-based teaching does offer experiences and insights that are not available elsewhere. That there is nothing that matches and can replicate that moment of encounter with a physical object that provides such a direct and yet complex window to past experience and alien cultures. The second phase of the University Engagement Programme has tried to do a number of things. It is very much focused on working out how to make the huge gains that have been achieved through the programme sustainable, and that is not a straightforward proposition. And indeed, it's not straightforward precisely because this has been such a well-funded programme by the Mellon Foundation, because we know that the tap will turn off in 3 years' time, and we need to find a way to replace that funding. And the only possible way of doing that is to persuade those receiving the teaching that it is something that they are prepared to pay for. And something that has been unquestionably a nice to have, we need to make the case that it is a need to have. And I think, although we have made that case very persuasively in certain quarters, I am not convinced we have made it institutionally. And there is a further challenge because the willingness to pay from different faculties is absolutely related to the ability to pay. And different faculties in Oxford, as I'm sure elsewhere, are in very different financial circumstances. And so whereas today the geography faculty is already paying for the teaching it is receiving from the University Engagement Programme because the geography faculty is not in deficit. In Oxford, the humanities are almost universally in deficit. And so there is a much more difficult conversation to have there. And it is, of course, although we do teach, as I say, into every division, we teach predominantly into the humanities. The other area, or another area of work has been developing tools that build upon the object teaching that we do. And so this is a project, again, separately funded, developing a website that links directly, that sits on the same platform as students use for their coursework and for their revision papers and reading lists and so on, but is directly linked to object-based teaching and object-based learning, and as you can see, I think, I'm moving through the pages here, it is arranged by course. So if there is a tutor teaching through objects or with objects on a particular course, then the objects themselves can be uploaded onto this site, and as one goes through, individual pieces have notes against them. Students can make their own revision notes against the objects and that they have been using in their classes. And so making the object as accessible as possible outside the opening hours of a museum or the study time within one of the study rooms. The final part of what the second phase has done is, I think, the most important and potentially the most fruitful. And this is what we're calling our faculty fellowships. Essentially this is to change the equation and to suggest that the teaching from the collection need not all be done from within the museum. That if we have 30 curators, they cannot provide all that is desired in terms of object-based teaching. And so the faculty fellowships involve buying members of faculty out of their teaching commitment for a number of hours per week during a term, inviting them into the museum and charging them with developing their own teaching collections from within the museum's collections, and obviously helping them in doing so. So they sit alongside curators, alongside museum assistants, develop their collections. At the same time, we digitize them so that they become electronic resources as well. And then, this is a process that has only just begun, although we've had about 6, 7 faculty fellows. We're taking in 2 a term at the moment as they develop their collections. Then they teach from them in either existing courses or courses that they are developing in the coming terms. Of course, this in itself will start putting demands on the museum that we are not quite sure how we shall meet. The demands are different, but they are again the museum assistants and the demands on space. And although, as I've said, we have our study rooms, we now realize we don't have enough of them. There is hope in sight because the collections of Oxford are focused on the development of a shared collections research centre, a shared storage space which we are now looking at and determined that it will have ancillary teaching spaces alongside the stored collections as well. So that, I hope, gives some sense of what has been happening at Oxford. It is still a developing story. I think it is yet to be proven that we will be able to sustain the levels of teaching that we are doing at the moment. But the faculty fellows at least suggest a way out of that bind, in that the teaching does not have to come from the museum itself. What is important is that the objects, these extraordinary collections, are used as intensively and as variously as they can be in the life of the university. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, Alexander. Now, all the questions that have come up in my brain concerning your role within the university, which you touched upon a whole lot, I will return to them later because you will listen to Alexander after the coffee break again. Now, since you've come here, I guess people are not only interested in the Ashmolean, they may be interested in you as well. You were the director, before this, you were the director of the Holburne Museum in Bath.
I was.
Tell us about that.
Yes, my museum career, and I've had a career in museums rather than higher education, so I was at the National Gallery, so a national museum.
I was going to ask about that too.
Funded,
yeah.
And then went to run this small, sort of perfect small museum, the Holburne Museum in Bath, which is entirely independent, no state funding at all, had to raise every penny it made in order to survive. But we did actually, in order to do that, make alliances with there are two universities in Bath, and we made alliances with both of them. And so actually the thinking about how museums might be used by within higher education was already in my head before moving to Oxford. Yeah. But it has to be said, the joy of a small independent museum with a single board of governors and a degree of fleetness of foot that gives one, that one can make decisions and act on them and move relatively swiftly. Of all the shocks in arriving at Oxford, it is, I think, as anywhere, that if one is part of a large organisation, fleetness of foot becomes that much more challenging.
Are there other institutions that have inspired you a lot? For your daily work now at the Ashmolean?
Well, I have yet to visit all my peers in terms of university museums. I was saying, go on a tour of those in the States, and I have to say Harvard, there are things that are happening at Harvard that I do find particularly inspiring. There are things that I think are completely wrong-headed about how it behaves as well.
I'll save that as well.
But I think the fact is that one takes inspiration, if you like, where one finds it. That,
sure.
And Yale too does extraordinary things in terms of using students to deliver its education service to schools. Which I think is really interesting, quite challenging, but really interesting as a model.
Yeah, sure.
And so, yes, I take inspiration all over.
Yeah. How many of you have been to the Ashmolean? Quite a few. Quite a few. That's great. A little education of ourselves as well. Mm-hmm. You talked about the no purpose about the collections from the beginning. I guess this Elias Ashmole would be very happy if he saw what you have today.
I think so. Yes,
he was an antiquary or
a
politician.
An antiquary, he was a lawyer. He was I think he would find the Ashmolean unrecognisable in that.
Sure.
His focus was the natural sciences. That's and now clearly we are a museum of art and archaeology, which is, I bet he wouldn't understand that particular taxonomy, I don't think. But he was also an antiquary. He collected coins. He wrote on the history of the Order of the Garter. He was an alchemist as well. And clearly the line between alchemy and science was a blurry one in the 17th century.
Sure.
But I do hope and believe that the alliance of teaching, research, the study of objects to understand the world and our place within it, remains core to, well, I think what all museums are, but it absolutely has to be what university museums are about.
Yeah.
There is an added, if you like, obligation to a university museum, which is around research and teaching, which I think is energizing, actually, and a privilege as well that one, if you like, has.
You mentioned the major challenges that are in front of you now. Which one is the biggest? Is it the replacing of the funding, or what is it?
Well, the replacing of the funding, yes, and the funding will end and we will survive. The challenge is to persuade the university of the and of the virtues, and I'm talking just about university teaching at the moment, of the virtues of what we are doing. And the difficulty in that sentence, certainly in the University of Oxford, and I suspect in most universities, is that there is no such thing as the university. So you're actually having to persuade countless different constituencies within the university. Yeah. And the challenge at the moment is that one's getting different answers in different quarters. Turning that into some sort of systematic way of teaching from the museum being recognised by the university. Because without that, there is no incentive to develop it. And in fact, it becomes difficult to develop it.
We will return to that too, sure, later on today. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation.